Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, Episode 70, The New Lions. As we talked about in the past, through the 9th century, the Merfyn line arose from basically out of nowhere, possibly the Isle of Man. We've obviously, as we've discussed many times, we don't know exactly where. From there, we had Rhodri the Great, and after that, the sons of Rhodri, who basically spread havoc throughout Wales, controlling and dominating most of the Welsh kingdoms at some point or other. And if they didn't, their descendants certainly had. In all of this point, as we've seen this happen, there have been challenges along the way. Many of these challenges coming from outside sources, but sometimes even from internal sources, internal combatants and competitors, trying to take back what had been taken from them, or in some cases revolting against the rule of these descendants of Merfyn. However, no one really ever succeeded against them to this point. No one had ever been able to throw them off permanently, and no one had ever been really able to stop them in dominating most of Wales, and in some cases all of Wales. However, this time as leader of the Pride, shall we say, or leader of the pack, in every situation there comes a point where that leadership is challenged. And when that leadership is challenged, how the Pride reacts to that challenge becomes very important. And we're going to talk about one of the leading challengers, and one that will actually come to dominate Wales for the better part of a century. And then, of course, adopt and adapt the Merfyn line back into their own and try and basically say that they too are descendants of the Merfyn line, so thus it didn't ever go extinct or out of existence. And so this kind of thing will continue on after this. But let's talk about it from what we're going to really point out, which is that this line does stop shortly after this, and there really isn't a return to that line, at least not on the patronymics of the situation. And we'll get into why that is, and what the justification is for why that is, and why there seems to be a need to point yourself back to that line all the time for the Welsh kings going forward after this. In 1018, as we had talked about previously a few episodes ago, Llywelyn ap Seisyl was alone on the throne of Gwynedd, a paragon of the new regime, and in all likelihood a new face for the old land. This was the new king, of course. He may have claimed some sort of descent to the Merfyn line by his mother, but that link is a later invention, at least from what we can understand, something of a 12th century invention. It didn't exist in the written claims that he had made and had been made by his propagandists, but certainly it is something that was later used to justify various things that went on, and certainly, as we said earlier, to try and create a link back to the old and back to the old ways. We see the same sort of thing happen with Merfyn coming to the throne. He claims to be a descendant out of the same, or at least his ancestry claims he is a descendant from this older line that had always existed as the head of the country known as Gwynedd, or the kingdom known as Gwynedd. So this is a fine, normal thing to do as a Welsh king. You adopted yourself into the line. If that adoption didn't exist in reality, it didn't matter, as long as you could prove, even with a shadow of a doubt, that's all it took. And certainly that was important to them, and that mattered. So this, of course, would be what makes him, in the eyes of others, a worthy king. But the reality is, his merit is what made him a worthy king. He actually won the throne. He defeated his enemies. He didn't seem to be a problem child king, at least on the face of what we can see. And we'll talk more about why that is. And so, in that respect, he may have been more worthy than the ones he replaced. But we don't know, because the information during this period is really sparse. And it only starts to grow again after this point. Because we know that from about 1004 to 1018, we didn't have a lot of information. There wasn't a lot to go on. So you didn't have a great deal of backing as to what was going on in Wales at this point in time. So we only really know after Llewellyn gets there and starts to actually create the new reality that we actually know what's going on again. By 1022, he's looking to secure a much wider hegemony within Wales. His title became both King of Gwynedd and King of all Britons. In the Welsh Chronicle, or the Annals, this was seen as an ambition for greater things. Quite often, in fact, they labeled better known or more successful kings as King of all Britain, even though, of course, the reality of that was negligible at best. It may have been 600 years since the Romans had left Britain, but the idea of uniting their former subjects was still the ambitions of the kings of Wales, or at least the preferred goal in why they took the title. It really hadn't been a thing of any particular use, probably since about the time of Gildas. I mean, we're talking most of these people wouldn't have had any point to look at to say, oh yeah, we're united. In fact, Wales itself to this point had never been fully united. So there was nothing to say that any of them should be called King of Britain, but that was something that was done. Now, whether they meant the kings of all Britain referring to just Wales becomes a question as well, because that they had a tendency to call Cornwall West Britain, and they had a tendency to look at the Old North in a different way. And by this point, most of what they considered to be the Old North is gone. And there's only just sort of the memory of the Old North, as the Picts, the Scots, and now the English were all fighting for possessions that were at one time what made up the Old North. So this kind of created part of the issue. As well, marriages were a method of securing territory or control or creating alliances, which, of course, proved very fruitful during the medieval period. This is a very common thing that would happen amongst kings. They would marry off their daughters to all sorts of princes and kings to try and create all of these previously mentioned ideas, with the idea of creating a new secure relationship, which seemed to be at the heart of these political marriages. And in this case, in the political marriage of Llewellyn to Angharad, the daughter of Merfyn, which would link him into the Merfyn throne. And if true, and I have no reason to think it isn't true, then you have at least that papering over of a link. But the reality is that, again, as we've talked about in the past, the Welsh didn't look at the matrilineal line when it came to kings. They didn't count, largely. But when you didn't have a king who was from the right line, then being able to at least point back at matrilineally to things at least helps you a little. So this is kind of what they did, and in this case, that's definitely what they were doing. And of course, again, we have people writing after the fact. So one of the other problems here maybe is that they're trying to justify Griffith and his descendants, and the way to do that is to link his father to the previously reigning line. Last month, we discussed how this led to his battle with the so-called pretender to the throne of the South, this suspected Irishman who had rose against the proper government of Wales and had to be put down. But legitimately, we don't actually know that this person was ever Irish. That whole tale is told after the fact and isn't even told in the lifetime of Llewellyn. So it could easily have been one of the descendants of Merfyn who's competing for the throne, who then they want to throw, as much shade on, to use a more modern term, as possible, and thus avoid having this other contender to the throne look legitimate. And certainly after his victory, Llewellyn seems to have settled into a much more familiar and peaceful phase, briefly anyway. After the ravages of war, he offers grants to various churches. He seeks to rebuild, likely to ease his soul on his death for the destruction he caused. That's a very common thing to do in the medieval period. One way to save yourself from purgatory and from hell for the things you've done wrong is, of course, to give gifts to the church, be that land, money, help with buildings, do various things, give them tax benefits. I mean, it was a very common thing, let's just put it that way, in that era. And it gave you a little bit of benefit, and it will become a bigger thing as we go along in this story. But for the moment, that's kind of where it starts in this whole idea. And I guess what we can say is that the Welsh annals seem to bear out that his propaganda won out. And likely, because he was so generous, those who then wrote the history were generous to him. And of course, who writes these histories? Well, of course, it's the clerics and the church. So obviously, his donations, his kindnesses, his largesses towards them would become, something to write about, because let's be honest, the clerics only really know what's happening with themselves. They don't necessarily know about the wider world or understand the day-to-day needs of a peasant.
Hey, podcast listeners, I'm Paul Brandis introducing my podcast, Countdown to Dallas. It's a fascinating, in-depth look at the seemingly unconnected events that led to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's based on my book of the same title. In that book and in this podcast, I go all the way back to 1939, when Lee Harvey Oswald was born into a troubled and dysfunctional family. I'll follow his transient and often violent teenage years and young adulthood, painting a fuller picture of the man who would later become Kennedy's killer. I also take a look at events unfolding in that era, like Cuba and Vietnam, and I'll unpack the conspiracy theories too, not one of which has ever been conclusively proven. Subscribe to Countdown to Dallas at evergreenpodcasts.com or your favorite listening app, October 31st.
The Battle of Waterloo was one of the most famous turning points in world history. But what happened next? My name's David Montgomery, and I'm the host of The Siècle, a history podcast that tackles exactly that. Join me as I cover France's overlooked century in between Napoleon and World War I. The Siècle, spelled S-I-E-C-L-E, is part of the Evergreen Podcast Network and can be found wherever you get podcasts.
In their community, to the same degree as they would know their own existence and their own problems and their own concerns. And much like that, the Viking raids were always sort of an overblown thing because it was happening mostly to churches, so it was made to act sometimes like they were pagans who were coming to ruin all of Christianity, when rather it was more about the fact that they were robbing the churches, because the churches were these easy banks they could go into with no security and take all the money. And so that, rather than a castle which had guards and soldiers and protection. So those are the kind of things that we kind of run into as you're dealing with not just that the winners are writing the story, but a very particular type of winner is writing the story. And of course, their perspective is going to count more than some other perspectives. So it also shows why we have so little on the women in this world at this point, where there's no real stories of the princesses and the queens and their opinions or their movements and motives, because a lot of the writers aren't female. So thus, they're not going to be writing from that perspective. They don't have that perspective and don't understand that perspective. So unfortunately, we're left with a lot of male point of views because of this. So this is kind of where a lot of this begins. However, only a year later in 1023, Llywelyn was dead, and 4 years later his brother Cynan had also been killed. Now, of course, later writers will blame this on other people, and we'll get a little bit more into this conspiracy theory in a bit. But we have, again, no evidence of it. It's past that point, so we don't have strictly reality. We have probably myth-making or possibly stories that have been handed down, which may or may not be true, depending on your point of view. So it's harder to say. It's harder to be sure, so I don't want to get into speculation with that as much. And so one of the things that happens out of this is Friedrich the king of Glamorgan becomes the king of Deuddbarth, and for the first time in the written memory, the kings of the southeast also control the southwest of Wales. The Book of Llandaff goes farther by claiming that all of Wales fell under his leadership, but most academics figure that's either a flourish or at the very least wishful thinking. It's hard to be 100% certain on that, simply because there is no obvious king in the north at this point, and there is what appears to be a vacuum in leadership there. So we don't actually know for sure, but we think at least that he was the king of the south, and maybe he does have a claim to have been the king of all of Wales, at least briefly, because things will degrade rapidly after this, as has happened pretty much since the beginning of this century and before even. In the meantime, in England, Canute becomes the first Viking king, and with him he brings Olaf, who in 1024 is purported to come to Wales seeking to, in quotes, lay waste, as it was described in the annals, but more likely to pillage and raid. Some academics feel that part of the reason for this is Olaf may have actually been Ilfrith Thorgilsson, who was an ally of Canute, who also happens to have been an ally of Merduth and Hewel, the sons of the previous kings of Gwynedd and of Deuddbarth, and he may have not been super happy to see his allies lose their place, and thus also lose their ability to pay him. So in this way, to get maybe some of his payment back that he was likely owed, he may have done what most Vikings do in that occasion and start raiding. And the reality of it is this is not uncommon for this to happen. Vikings were hired as mercenaries quite frequently, and so they end up fighting on both sides of wars, even against other Vikings. And so likely he may have been hired gun to deal with their grievance, and then at the defeat of that group turned around and decided to take some of his own from that. He eventually flees to England, and then after the death of Canute in 1035, he actually flees England as well. And then we never hear about him again. And in that respect, he only makes a very brief appearance in our record, but it's enough of a one to get a note about it. Of course, with the death of Llywelyn, the leadership in the north and south of Wales returns to the hands of the line of Merfyn. First, Iago ap Idwal gains the throne, and the sources again have this change happening later. Because there is this absence of who the leader is in the north until 1033, we don't know when Iago took over. Meanwhile, the sons of Edwin, the other brother, Hewel and Merduth, who we mentioned earlier, defeat Llwydrich in 1033. And this would give us plausibility, going back to our comment earlier, as to why Wales may have been dominated by the Southern King for nearly a decade, because it's 1033 that becomes the distinguishing point when these groups seem to take back over. There are some older academics from the Tudor period that describe the downfall of Cynan and Llywelyn as a dirty deed of Hewel and Merduth, but there's no written or circumstantial evidence of this happening. There's no comment in the period that this ever happened. This is just supposition, and especially with older academics coming out of periods where they didn't have the same rigor of research, specifically out of the Tudor period, which is a monarchy that claimed Welsh descendancy, so thus they would have a vested interest to show certain things. This might be a reason why this was tilted the way it was. We don't really know why that argument was ever made, and certainly there was nothing coming out of later writers before that that said that it had ever been the case. But nonetheless, that accusation has been made, and in the Welsh history, there's no reason not to think that there may have been that going on, but it's unfounded, so we don't have any clue. So while Iago seems to have kept esteem enough to be left alone, Merduth was not so lucky, and according to the annals, he was the first of killed, and in this case by the sons of Cynan, who may have been seeking revenge in this period. So by 1035, only Hywel and Iago remain as leaders in charge of the two biggest kingdoms in Wales. And there would remain an uneasy peace in Wales for the next few years, but it was short and not even half a decade in length. And as problems would be created later by the Norman invasion of Anglo-Saxon England, this stability in Wales at this point just appears to be impossible. From Saxons, Vikings, and fellow Welsh, they all seem to fight over these kingdoms from this period, constantly bickering and trying to grab control. And really, this only starts to change when Gruffydd, the son of Llywelyn, comes along. And Gruffydd is going to be a massive figure in Welsh history and is going to be the first proper king of Wales we ever have, and really probably the last. And he is huge in his footprint on Wales. He becomes the first of our kings who actually has a biography about him. He becomes the first king to receive attention to be written about consistently by other sources outside of Wales. He is an important figure in the high medieval period, and he will be someone we're going to talk in depth about in the next episode. So stay tuned, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can also reach me online at Welsh History Pod on Twitter, or you can come on our Facebook and ask questions there if you want at Welsh History Pod, facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And certainly if there's anything else you have interest in the content that we provide, you can check everything else we do at distractionsmedia.com. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming along on the ride, and we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Edge of the Abyss Creations is a proud sponsor of the Welsh History Podcast, your one-stop shop for unique jewelry, paintings, and other crafty creations. You can find us at facebook.com/edgeoftheabyss1.
This has been a Distractions Media production. For more info, you can check out everything we do at distractionsmedia.com.
Whether it's missing flights or retirements out of the blue, whether it's resignations or bans, as the old saying goes, there's never a quiet day in West Indies cricket. So make sure you listen to West Indies on 99.94 to stay up to date with all the latest fallout with the teams in maroon.